Good evening. Hi, folks. Let us know where you're watching from. Welcome to Opening Doors. Freight train, runs so fast. Freight train, runs so fast. Please don't tell what train I'm on, so they won't know what route I've gone. This seemed like an appropriate song to start with today. Elizabeth Cotten comes from North Carolina. She was born in 1893, and her birthday was this past week on January 5th. Which brings us nicely to our guest tonight. Dom Flemons is from Arizona, but he got his musical start, or came to national notice, with the Carolina Chocolate Drops. Dom is a Grammy winner with the Carolina Chocolate Drops. He's been nominated for Grammy on his own for Black Cowboys for Best Folk Album. He put out his third solo album this past year, Prospect Hill, the American Songster Omnibus, or 2020. And Dom will be splitting donations for tonight's interview and performance with the Music Maker Relief Foundation. And Tim Duffy from the foundation will be joining us a little bit later to talk about the work that organization does. Hi, Doug. Hi, Red Yarn. Hi, Liz. Hi, Eva. Good to see y'all. Let me introduce and bring on camera Dom Flemons. Hey, Dom.
Hey, how's it going, Alistair?
I'm great, man. Good to see you.
Yeah, great to see you as well. Thanks for having me on the program.
So glad to have you. Been looking forward to this. Can you tell us a little bit about where you grew up, your first introduction to all this weird old music that we like? How'd that start for you?
Oh, well, it was a funny sort of journey being in Phoenix, Arizona. Um, you know, I kind of just grew up listening to music that was on the radio at first, and a lot of that was like a lot of alternate music and things like that. But I guess when I was about 16 or 17, I saw a documentary on the history of rock and roll, and they had one episode that was dedicated to the folk music revival, and that really interested me. It got me deep into the music of people like Bob Dylan and Phil Oakes. Also, in that particular documentary, they had a small clip of Lightning Hopkins playing Mojo Hand, and that really kind of set a spark in my imagination for the blues. Even though at that time I wasn't quite sure what that was or what that meant, it allowed me to start a search. That I began to go to my local library and started to try to figure out what all this old time music was about. And so I began to learn songs, and I began to meet different performers that were performing around Phoenix at first. And it continued from there.
Correct me if I'm wrong, your heritage is African American and Mexican.
Yeah.
Were you exposed to Mexican music in the Phoenix area growing up? Was that part of the local scene, or was that just as distant there as it is up here?
Well, it matters how you think about it. I went to many different like folkloric performances because of course in Arizona the Mexican population is the dominant demographic in the state, and so there were a lot of different presentations of traditional Mexican music around. I wouldn't say I necessarily performed Mexican music per se. For a short time in high school, I seconded as a guitar player in a small rondalla, which is a Mexican string band, and I played harmonica and guitar for a season or so with them. That was back when I was first starting, but
Okay.
of course I was always open to different ways to get my music out there.
I'm curious. I've heard you talk a little bit in the past about that rock documentary. I'm curious and you've mentioned Dylan and Phil Oakes, which well, it's not surprising, but your career and the parts of music you focused on, you've kind of moved backwards or looked at older forms, really gone to the roots of some of this stuff. I'm curious what grabbed you with those lyricist guys. What was it that drew you in, do you think?
Well, I was always drawn to poetry from the very beginning, before I even started to play guitar. And I was always drawn to different parts of older poetry, whether it was people like Edwin Arlington Robinson or William Blake or E. E. Cummings or Langston Hughes. Those are things that were all being taught in these, my standard uh, English literature classes in high school and whatnot. So I was always drawn to poetry, the way that poetry went together, long form poetry as well, and narrative poetry. So I also was listening to reading Samuel Taylor Coleridge and people like that as well. So I was getting quite deep into the classics. And from there, I found that as I got into folk music, I found that there was an aspect of literature that went with folk music that included a lot of the old ballads, many from the UK, as well as many of the American ballads, such as John Henry or Stack of Lee. And so the idea that a song could have alternate lyrics, alternate narratives, and could be composited, as they say in the folkloric term, but paced together in such a way to create a different experience for the performer as well as the audience. That was something that intrigued me from the beginning. And so the documentary just gave me names to put in place of this sort of a desire to know more about the literature of old time and folk music. Of course, at the time, being someone who was born in 1982, I came of age at a time when we were in a golden age of reissues of older material, material that had been taken out of the archives from the 1920s and 30s from some of the major labels and reissued on CD for the first time. And so there was a long period of time where I was keeping up with the newest releases that were coming out at that time and learning about the music in that way as well. So you had multiple multiple ways of getting the music, whether it was through a documentary. There was also the older record stores that carried used copies of many of these old LPs. And before there was a large resurgence of vinyl record reissues, vinyl was very cheap. So also as someone who was not necessarily a rich person, I also found vinyl records were a way for me to be able to listen to music for much less money than I could pay to get a brand new CD at a certain point. So there was a lot of that searching. And of course, when you go into a record store, you find all sorts of interesting, obscure, independent labels and artists that might not be the mainstream. And so I was always interested in that idea. So there was a little bit of that going on. And then whatever songbooks might be available. You have to imagine this is the time before the internet. So to learn any of these songs, you either had to sit with the record or you could potentially find maybe an old Stephen Grossman guitar workshop songbook somewhere that was collecting dust in the library. But
Yeah.
there weren't a ton of sources. So it took a lot of searching and a lot of practice and a lot of talking to people to figure out some of these styles.
Yeah. I'm curious. I want to come back and ask you about your sort of interest in arcana. If I don't know what the right word is, these old things, and it's not just music. It's you clearly have a love for finding oddities or finding little pieces of history and sort of bringing them into the present. I'm curious about that part of your personality. But before we go too far, would you play a song for us?
Oh, sure thing. Well, you got me thinking already. Since we're going to have Tim Duffy on later, and it was Elizabeth Cotton's birthday the other day. I want to do a little medley of some of the Piedmont pickers that I put together a couple years back. I'll start off with a little bit of Elizabeth Cotton. I'll switch it out today and do a little bit of "Oh Babe, It Ain't No Lie," which is one that Elizabeth Cotton wrote when she was a young girl. And then I'll play a little bit of Etta Baker and her version of "Railroad Bill." And Etta Baker was a legacy music maker artist, and Tim can talk about her a little bit. And then I'll play a little bit of the Cannonball Blues from Leslie Riddle, who is a African American musician who's gotten a little more acclaim over the years because he traveled with A.P. Carter when A.P. was collecting songs for his group, the Original Carter Family. But we'll start with Oh Baby It Ain't No Lie. I'll do this instrumental just to show off a little bit of this beautiful Piedmont picking. And when I was back in Arizona, I fell in love with the music of Elizabeth Cotten, and that's what really got me wanting to go to North Carolina in the first place. So here's a little bit of what I picked up.
Yeah, man. I love it. We were talking before the show. Etta Baker and Elizabeth Cotten, both from North Carolina, different generations. Etta, I saw play down in Kentucky and an event that was transformative for me in the way that it, well, I shouldn't assume that, but you came out to North Carolina and went to this Black Banjo festival. What was it called?
No, it was the Black Banjo Gathering. Yeah, it was. It was. Well, now it's seems like a sort of a clandestine event nowadays. It was a program that was put on at Appalachian State University, and it came out of actually a listserv that was dedicated to Black banjo players. It was called Black Banjo Players Then and Now, and it was started by a fellow named Tony Thomas. And what had happened was that Tony had noticed that there was uh, quite a bit of information on African American banjo playing that could be found in the archives. And when he tried to bring this information to the forefront, he found that he had gotten a lot of flack. So he decided to make his own listserv that would be just dedicated to talking about African American banjo players, but then it eventually turned into African American string bands and the string band traditions that they all represent. Because of course the study of African American folk music generally tends to be relegated to the study of blues and gospel and spiritual music. But string band music has always sort of had a sort of a nebulous role in the documentation of African American music, because of course it is connected in some ways to antebellum times and slave culture, but it's also interrelated to country music and bluegrass music. And so the discussion of African American participation or influence, that was still a fairly new conversation when you get to the early 2000s. And so, nevertheless, this listserv grew, and there were a lot of different people, white and black, scholars and non-scholars, that wanted to know more information about African American string band music. And so the gathering then developed and manifested itself during the traditional music week at Appalachian State University, actually under the guidance of a woman by the name of Dr. Cecilia Conway, who wrote one of the first major books on African American string band music called Black Banjo Echoes in Appalachia. Mm-hmm. And she also released a companion CD on Smithsonian Folkways called Black Banjo Players or Black Banjo Songsters of North Carolina and Virginia. And so those are sort of the big groundbreaking movements that were happening. So in 2005, this gathering comes together. I was a part of it as a participant. My former bandmate Rhiannon Giddens was also a part of it. And also Tony Thomas from the listserv, Dr. Cecilia Conway. There were two African musicians, Shekemale Jabate from Mali, who played the ubone, which is a small boat-like instrument, played for the royal court. And then there was a fellow by the name of Daniel Jata, who played an instrument called the akonting, which is a folk instrument from the Gambia. And it was actually almost looks like a giant 5-string banjo, but of course this one has one short string and 2 long strings on it, so it's a slightly different instrument. But these traditions were interconnected. There were also other people that would have an influence on me, as many others, when it comes to the research of African American participation in this type of music. Bela Fleck was there. He had just come back from Africa and was there just as an observer of the event. Tony Trishka was there. Also, a music maker artist by the name of Aljamae Hinton, who was also a guitarist and a banjo player. She was there. Okay. Mike Seeger, who would have a great influence on me. I got to meet him there, as well as Joe Thompson and Bob Carlin, who would also have a very profound effect on my life as I began to work with Joe Thompson shortly after the gathering.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about Joe Thompson. First of all, I'm struck by, as we talk. So I'm 10 years older than you. We're generally of the same generation, but even in those 10 years, I sense the changing direction of the folk music community. In the way when I was growing up, some of my first influences, first people I heard do music like this were Taj Mahal, Well, Taj Mahal was a big one. I learned
Yeah.
about Piedmont picking from Taj, and my group of friends in high school, we discovered him and, thought he was great. But as I started to play music, I spent a lot of time looking around and saying, where are the black musicians doing this music that comes from black tradition? As I spent many more years doing this, and over the years, I opened for folks like Guy Davis, and sort of here and there, you find people. I don't think it wasn't that people weren't around, but there certainly weren't a lot of these kinds of gatherings and conferences that were bringing focused attention to a sort of an Afrocentric musical experience, and connecting dots between Africa and America, and gathering black community. This feels like something that is a generational shift. What was your sense when you met people? So Joe Thompson, it was a great fiddler, and was considered maybe the last fiddler of the black string band tradition in North Carolina. When you met him, he was elderly, and you guys, the Carolina Chocolate Drops, or what became, you spent a lot of time with him. What was his reaction to an event like this? Did he sort of take it in stride, or was it sort of like, where's this been for the last
Mm.
70 years of my life? Or
Well,
what was your impression?
Well, it was interesting with Joe specifically because Joe had always wanted to see more Black participation within his musical tradition. Like many tradition bearers of the South, for one reason or another, his family hadn't wanted to take on the tradition, and he hadn't found anybody that would learn the songs in the traditional way, sitting with him to learn the numbers. And again, there's a variety of reasons for that. Half of his family had moved up to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, following the work, going up there, and any number of reasons had happened. But when we started to work with him as the Carolina Chocolate Drops and began to perform his songs, he saw that there was a value in seeing Black performers performing the songs. Not that he didn't mind sitting with people and having folks come visit him, learn his songs, and have them enjoy the music as just a general rule. He was very open to all of that. But I then also heard later on, talking with people like Bob Carlin, who'd worked with him years before, he had mentioned that Joe had wanted to see more African American participation. But one thing to always keep in mind with this, when it comes especially to folk music, that earlier than physical memory for the current generation, there is always you're always one step removed in one way from the a one-to-one connection with some of the traditional music. And so when performing folk music, you are also trying to present a a culture that sometimes exists currently, other times it does not exist currently, and trying to be able to present the emotions, the feelings, and also sort of the musical expertise that defines older generations. That can be quite a daunting task. And it sometimes can be very heady. Again, as a performer, you have to sort of look at the material and learn the material. But then there's also a period of time where you have to internalize the material and try to think about it beyond just the physical performance of a song. You have to start thinking about the deeper implications that sometimes a song can present to you when it comes to describing a certain time and place and space. And so that's something that when I first started going to the gathering, for example, like Joe Thompson would not have been able to explain to you that his fiddling style directly came from Africa, and would be able to point to a family member that would have been African necessarily. That wasn't necessarily what Joe, that wasn't his role. But by the time I met him at the Black Banjo gathering, he'd had a chance to work with folklorists and had had a chance to work with a series of performers that had been, as they say, rediscovered, but they were found in their communities playing these older styles, and then had been elevated to the place where they were then presenting music for a university audience. So
Right.
when I met Joe Thompson, he had been doing that for several decades. First, he had been playing with his cousin Odell, who had passed away. and he was continuing to perform with Bob Carlin, again, a very well accomplished banjo player in his own right in many different
A white
capacities.
musician, right?
What now?
A white musician.
Oh, yeah, a white musician
Yeah.
who's an accomplished banjo player, who's a scholar in the instrument itself. He also
Yeah.
worked with John Hartford in the Aeroplane Band, and is a very accomplished old time music performer. And so Bob, having worked with Joe for many years, once Odell had passed away, uh, he then started to work with Joe as well and performed as the banjo player with Joe's fiddling tradition, because of course Joe's tradition was built on a duo style of old time fiddle and 5 string banjo. And
Mm-hmm.
so by the time I met him out at the gathering, it was at an event where you had a lot of different scholars trying to figure out how do we start talking about this narrative that reaches back into some of the earliest American history as well as world history once you start to open up the channels from the United States to the Caribbean back to Africa. What are the best ways to bring all of this information into one room and present it to an American public? So Joe Thompson was amongst all of these performers. And of course, on my end, going from the early folk music that I spoke about before, hearing the music of people like Leadbelly and Woody Guthrie, going back farther into the music of the 1920s with people like Charlie Patton or the Mississippi Sheiks. When I met Joe Thompson, I was able to make a connection to the early songster traditions that are part of the earliest parts of blues history. And I found that there was a connection in the type of string band music that Joe Thompson was doing that connected to people like Charlie Patton and Leadbelly. So for me, there was a whole other type of musical tradition that was underneath the surface of the string band music that Joe Thompson was presenting as well. So when I began to start interpreting his music and playing within the group, I always wanted to make sure that I was incorporating aspects of blues, jug band music, black string band music that I'd heard that was not only Joe's, but some of the other wonderful performers that I heard about either from people at the gathering or other recordings that I came across in my own journeys. But it became a composite of trying to show what made African American string band music so special and unique, because it wasn't always a straight path. There were
Right.
many, there was a lot of common repertoire that you had to kind of look through. You had to find some of the subtleties of what some of the black string bands that recorded were doing, and then also many of these string bands were so underrepresented in terms of just the volume of recording compared to white string bands. There was also a period of time of trying to understand the subtleties of regional style compared to what would be maybe racial or ethnic styles, because there was a lot of that as well. So when we did the Chocolate Drops, there was a lot of work that had to be done to learn the traditional music as Joe Thompson was playing it, but
Mm-hmm.
then also in presenting it, how do we present it in a way that would seem modern and also would be uh, presenting a fuller, more broad, and more diverse narrative that may or
Right.
may not have been a part of the general narrative of folk music history at that particular time.
I wanna break there for a second, and so for folks who don't know, this is the Carolina Chocolate Drops. You guys formed in what year? It was
Oh,
2000.
that was we had started a group called Sankofa Strings in 2005. And
Okay.
then by the beginning of 2006, I had moved out to North Carolina. And that was when we began the Carolina Chocolate Drops.
Okay.
And we had started a group with Rhiannon, who's sitting in the middle next to me, and a
Mm-hmm.
third fellow, Justin Robinson, who's not pictured here. This is
Right.
actually the second version of the group
Right.
where we had Hubby Jenkins, who is a performer from New York City, who I had met in my journeys. He
Mm-hmm.
works with the Jalopy Theater up in Brooklyn a lot, and then
Oh yeah.
Layla McCalla. And Layla McCalla was someone that Tim Duffy and I had learned about at the same time. And Tim put out her first album, Very Colored Songs, and and then I had her guest on the second major label album that the Chocolate Drops had done, Leaving Eden. I had her guest on the song Leaving Eden, the title track. and that was what led her to begin her career in playing music. And so
Okay.
we had there was for me there was always a notion of being able to open a doorway or open a pathway. And of course, this goes back to my upbringing. So my 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 parents, my father, his father, my grandfather, was a preacher in the Church of God in Christ. He was a traveling minister in the Upper Arizona um, quadrant of the district up there. So he was very much a holiness person that was about putting his hands on the people and really connecting with people on the ground level.
Hmm.
And that was a part of my upbringing. So he had a very, very, very old timey way that he lived, and and on the other side, though, my mother, who's Mexican by heritage, uh, she was raised by her stepfather, and her stepfather, his name was Bill Dickey, and he was a middle class black man from Pennsylvania, and he came to Arizona, and his family. Um, they were part of the civil rights movement of Phoenix, and so they were very prominent business people. So
Hmm.
my ideas of blackness are very diverse. I grew up with people in my family that were from upper class, lower class, middle class, also coming from country backgrounds from the South, as well as urban backgrounds. So the idea of black music has always been very broad. My parents were into a lot of R&B and soul, and my grandparents on my mom's side were deep into jazz and bebop, and so there was that aspect of the black community and what black music was and is. But there was always a notion that from where they stood with the struggles they had to fight, me as a grandchild or as a descendant of these special people that were part of a special generation, the world was my oyster, and there was
Hmm.
always a notion that when you go into a room, you are supposed to be there. And
Hmm.
there are a lot of people in my family who were the first non-white people to do things in Phoenix. And so for me, when I went out to North Carolina and went to the gathering, and also how I approach music is that I'm supposed to be there.
Hmm.
And when I find history that may be lesser known, part of the goal is to present it so that people can know that this history was there in spite of whether we knew about it or not. It's still valid history that is a part of the narrative. And I think that that's something that's continues to be a very important struggle, as well as a very important learning and teaching moment for anybody who's into folk music.
Yeah. There's so much to dig into there, Dom. One thing that, the first time I heard of the Chocolate Drops, I thought, here we go. This is a group. I've been waiting for this group to come along. You brought a lot of intentionality as a group. There was a lot of style. You're a handsome group of people.
Mhm.
And you figured out a way to make this traditional music feel modern and alive. But it was married to, I know Rhiannon has called herself an armchair ethnomusicologist. I mean, none of you went to school to study ethnomusicology, but in the same way that Pete Seeger and Mike and Peggy were performers who were steeped in the traditions, could speak, sort of translate with the scholar class, but then put the thing in motion, actually be able to perform the tunes and speak to a crowd and do the living thing of performance. Seems very much what you guys did from the beginning. You brought and some of that I imagine is tricky because there's a lot of code switching going on, to sort of switching between audiences, going from a college audience to being able to connect with older string band people. At the same time, what you talk about with Joe, I think is so crucial, is that, you know, so often, having spent years in sort of folk circles and a lot of sort of head scratching and soul searching of, why are our gatherings so white? Where are the artists of color? underneath that is, what are you doing to actually bring people to the table? How welcome do folks feel? But also, there's sort of a divide sometimes between the idea of what is sort of elevated to high art, who is asked to come speak to traditions, who is considered to be an expert, and who is considered more to be. It's sort of this folk art versus high art thing. And it seems to me that you guys came right through the middle of that and were able to translate as a new, young, college educated generation of Black folks doing this music. And you met with some good success fairly quickly once you came together as a group. I think I'm right in saying.
Mhm. Oh, yeah, absolutely. You know, that was one of the things that made the group so amazing, as an experience. You know, of course, I was also the documentarian for the group, so I also documented all of our adventures, and that you can find that at the Southern Folklife Collection in Chapel Hill.
Okay.
Um, you know, my degree was in ancient literature and English, and so I studied written English, prose, poetry, and also, as I mentioned before, being a fan of music, I also was I've always been a very avid reader of books that concern music and also the thoughts of musicians. And so if I got into a particular performer, I would pick up a book of their interviews. I don't know, say someone like Tom Waits, for example, if I just threw something random out there. Or maybe recently I picked up a wonderful book from Happy Traum, that's the guitar styles of Brownie Mcgee. And I bought it because there is an autobiography in Brownie McGee's own words talking about his entire career. Mm-hmm. And those are the sort of things that I'm always drawn to. I want to know what musicians are thinking when they're making the music they make. I got to thinking about, because again, watching documentaries a lot, I got to thinking about, what did this iconic pioneer musician think about their music when they were doing it? What sort of thoughts were in their heads? What sort of things inspired them? How'd they keep going? You know, any type of question. And so that's been a part of my trajectory in general. And so for when I started to present traditional music, I found that talking to the media, it was a very important tool to be able to tell stories that were a part of the written tradition of history as we know it in folk music, but to also bring in the additional, I don't know, connecting dots, I'll call them that, little connecting dots that bring different parts of the narrative together. Mm. For example, when I did the Piedmont medley there, that on top of the music I was playing, it's also a geographic story, because Etta Baker came from Carrboro, North Carolina, which is in the lower part of North Carolina, the middle of the state. Etta Baker is from Morganton, North Carolina, which is up toward the mountains, right before you get to Black Mountain and Asheville and those places. And then south of there, you have Burnsville, where Leslie Riddle is from. And by just playing the different regional styles associated with those different parts of North Carolina, I've been able to present a narrative of a regional journey. And of course, there are a lot of trains in North Carolina, Piedmont songs. And so just being able to have a little bit of that train rhythm, mm-hmm. is something that's very important. And then being able to talk about someone like Leslie Riddle being connected to A.P. Carter. Those are the sort of things that I found very important right from the very beginning. So from 2005 on, I've always tried to present these sort of little connecting dots into the narrative. So the Carolina Chocolate Drops was not only just a band, it was also a conduit for people to find more information about the things we were talking about, instead of it just being something about us. And it wasn't just me, which was, to me, when I first got involved in the folk community, I found that me music was really the dominant type of music. So in 2005 and to 2008, it was always important to be able to bring traditional music back in, bring a little bit more of the power of a story that's more universal and robust, and something that's not just talking about the inner feelings of a single person. And so that was a big part of why the group didn't write songs necessarily at first, and why we were based so much within traditional music, because people were that starved for it. And they were that starved for a full string band, not just individuals, which is one of the things also African American individual roots music performers have been prevalent in the scene for pretty much the whole history of folk music. But to have a full group was something that was very innovative for that time.
That's
Um,
a great point. I hadn't thought about it in that terms, but I think that makes a lot of sense, and that felt new. Even it felt new in its oldness, right?
yeah,
It's reclaiming something that, for a lot of different reasons, has been pushed to the side. Um, I want to bring Tim in and talk some about the work that you guys are doing with music makers. Um, Before I do, can you play us into that? Can you
yeah,
play?
sure.
You know, I don't know if you're prepared to do this, but since we're talking
Yeah,
about a tradition, I'd love to go the other way. And
yeah.
part of the traditions that we love is also writing songs. So that me and the tradition always went together, right? And I know you write songs. Do you have one of
Oh,
your own you
sure,
could play? Great.
sure. I could do a. Let me see. This is a. Since you're gonna have Tim on, I'll do one of the songs from my Black Cowboys album. This is one called "He's a Lone Ranger," and this one is about the Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves. And I can't help but think about one of the musicians I got to meet when I first began to work with Tim Duffy, a fellow by the name of John D. Holman, who passed away this last year. And he influenced how I do this boogie woogie. So here's a little bit of He's a Lone Ranger. He's a U.S. Marshal and a Lone Ranger. He is a U.S. Marshal and a Lone Ranger. He is a Lone Ranger. Bass Reeves is his name. There was a man way out west, rode around this country with the star on his breast. Every white man and Indian tribe. He was the baddest man that ever was alive. He's a U.S. Marshal and a Lone Ranger. He's a Lone Ranger. Bass Reeves is his name. Broad-shouldered and 6 feet tall, rode a sorrel like an hour on a mall. Master of a pistol, master of disguise. He looked every man he caught now dead in the eyes, 'cause he's a U.S. Marshal and a Lone Ranger. He's a Lone Ranger. Bass Reeves is his name. Master called Bass Reeves to a gambling game. Bass's freedom was the stake that he made. No Master cheated. You ought to heard the sound of Bass's hoof beats as Master hit the ground. Now he's a U.S. Marshal and a Lone Ranger. He's a Lone Ranger. Bass Reeves is his name. Excuse me.
You all right there?
Yeah,
It
just
sounded
got
great.
a little frog in my throat on that one.
It's the worst when you're playing. That was great. Thank you, Dom. Let's bring in co-founder and director of Music Maker Foundation, Tim Duffy, to join us here.
Hey, Dom, that was great.
Hey, hey, Tim.
That was
Welcome,
fun.
Tim.
Thank you, Alistair.
Can you tell us some about Music Maker, what you guys do, and how you met Dom originally?
Okay, Music Maker Foundation is a nonprofit organization founded in 1994 dedicated to helping the true pioneers of Southern music. And we do that by helping the artists themselves. We call them partner artists, we have a Sustenance Program. A lot of our artists are living on $7,000 to $9,000 a year, if you can imagine that. And so There's a lot of food insecurity. Prescription medicine goes without. So there's a program that we give people a monthly stipend of $100 or $200 to cover groceries or heating oil. We have a COVID-19 program right now helping people who have lost a lot of work. We've kept that going on since the beginning of the pandemic. We have the performance program. Before the pandemic, we had over 150 shows a year, and then we around the world. And we have an education program where we've done close to 200 CDs and 4 exhibits that tour around, museum exhibits, and 3 books. So we do that. I met Dom at Shikori Hills Festival. I had heard of this string band helping one of our artists that I knew that he talked about, Joe Thompson. And then they were playing a little festival. My sister-in-law, Karen Duffy, told me to go see them, and it was electrifying.
This was the Chocolate Drops?
The Chocolate Drops performing at a dance tent. I stood in line. I think there was 98 people there, and 98 people lined up to sell the 50 CDs they had, and they sold out quick. And anyways, I met Dom, and I didn't sleep for days, but we offered to help manage them. And I could see the whole thing. They're an electrifying group, beautiful young people that 3 very different artists getting together. And it was just electrifying, like seeing like the Beatles of old time music or something. It was just, truly electrifying.
And I'm sorry I didn't grab a picture with the original 3rd member, Justin.
Justin was and they're very unique. And if you meet them individually and you hadn't met them before, you wouldn't have a hard time ever thinking they would be in the same room together. They're completely different people.
I've gathered a little of that, yeah.
Rhiannon's a classical Oberlin trained opera singer. Yeah. That was into Irish music, and Justin is this, eccentric artist, and who happens to be one of the best fiddlers that ever played the fiddle. And then you have Dom, this heady academic that has more rhythm in his little finger than Chuck Berry has in his whole hand. I mean, so what do you do with that? It's just truly exciting. And that they were together for nearly 10 years is remarkable, and they changed the course. When I went to study, I'm a folklorist, and went to Warren Wilson College, and when he was born, it was hidden knowledge that the banjo was an African instrument. That was something that folklorists said in the closets, in closed rooms, in basements. You wouldn't say that publicly. In Asheville, you might get hit. You might get violent attack if you told a hillbilly that they were playing African music. I saw Alan Lomax get berated by saying that at a big folklore conference. He was going around saying that forever. And Wade Maynard, ran out of the room screaming, when Alan said Wade was playing black music. So I knew how radical they were in a second, and with the opportunity the world had to have these guys as ambassadors to bring this stuff forth, and they changed the American musical landscape in about 5 minutes.
Tim, one of the things that seems very cool about music makers is that you guys are looking at newer artists like these guys were at the time, and mentoring and helping to bring along younger artists, and you're also helping to support and amplify older artists who've been doing it for a long time, people like Joe.
Yeah, well, this is the deal. Well, not the deal, but what happens, very few people get through to be seen, period. Right. Most people are not seen. And if you're a person of color, or you're a person of a lower social economic scene, you're not seen, period. And then even if you want to get known in the music business, even if you try really hard, the vast majority are never seen. Even people like John and Alan Lomax, who spent their lives trying to find people. Alan told me, and it always stuck, he only saw the tip of the iceberg of music that was created in America. Like people like Etta Baker and Elizabeth Cotten, who got to see a black woman? A black woman was raped by their master. That was about all good a black woman was for. You know, that's the reality, and still kind of the reality. And that people like, but they were making music in the parlor and educating. Every bluesman I learned from or met was most 85% or 90% learned from their mothers. Who tells that story?
Yeah.
You know, so nobody. We have Elizabeth Cotten and Etta Baker, a couple others, but there was tens of thousands of mothers teaching these people this music. So, like you said, I'm getting on my high horse, but we always encourage young people that come in and get the music. I think actually at that time I was getting CDs into distribution, and I was pleased that Dom actually checked out some of my CDs in the Arizona Public Library.
Yep, that's true.
And so we got the music out, however you can get it out there. And that's what we do.
So the way we ask our kind viewers and listeners for donations on this program is that we share it with we send it to the artist, in this case Dom, and the artist split it with the organization.
Oh, thanks.
Oh yeah, man.
Of their choice.
Thank you, Dom. Dom's a hell of a board. He's been on my board since I don't know how many.
Yeah. 2009, Jim.
Yeah, long time.
That's what I wanted to ask. So Dom
and I've been through the mill together. We've done all sorts of big things, and Dom's one of the greatest educated, most champion person. Every time I talk to him, I learn more about something I've been studying all my life. But it's just amazing what this guy knows. He's such a fountain of knowledge. It's incredibly deep.
Dom, as a board member for the organization now, what's your focus with the group? What do you love about what this group's doing, and how are you paying it forward?
Well, you know, there are a couple of different ways that Music Maker has helped me as well as many others for years. Of course, first there's the music, and when you support Music Maker, one of the things that Tim's been doing for a while is created a series called the Listener's Circle.
Oh, thank you, Dom.
He takes they do deep digs into the archives of Music Maker and find tracks that sometimes had been released, but other times had not been released before. When it came to the Carolina Chocolate Drops, we put out 4 releases with Music Maker. And like Tim mentioned, being seen is one of the hardest things that can happen in the music industry. And so the fact that Tim was able to champion us so early on, we did 4 releases with him. And then I did 3 releases with him myself as a solo artist. And the tireless work that Tim's done for us that's something that, now it stands the test of time. But also the many other artists that Tim works with, as he's mentioning, that a lot of the people are working with $7,000 to $10,000 a year. And to be able to help empower a community organizer that is a musician in a rural community, and be able to give them just enough so that they can, have their music in front of them instead of having to choose between their music and their medicine. That in of itself starts the process of healing that can happen. And that's one of the things that I love about Music Maker is that, Tim will find out about someone who's had some hard times, and then he'll bring it to the board and ask us if we're feeling up for helping out. And also if there are any board members or if there are any supporters of Music Maker that might have an instrument that they could donate. And that in of itself goes a long way. And it's amazing what just caring and doing what Tim says is giving a hand up and not a hand out knowing what that can do for a community. That's something that I've always just enjoyed.
And when I chime in, when we just did a survey of the artists, we do it at the end of the year every year. And one thing, besides all the money or the gigs, well, the gigs is a big thing, is these people are like Dom. They're holding on to archaic traditions in their community. Things that a lot of more popular African American musical traditions have come on and gone past, but they're holding on to this music because it's their grandfathers or uncles. And then when they meet other people in the music maker community that do that, they build a community. And they say that's the biggest thing they get from music maker. So when we all get like a Texas bluesman and an Alabama bluesman and a Georgia bluesman together for a festival and we play a show, that's just the beginning. They all trade phone numbers and they're on the phone every day or every week talking. And that sense of family and community of like when you go into elderly, no matter how much money you have in the world, if you're isolated and you're lonely.
Yeah.
You know,
Yep.
so providing that kind of community so people have a sense, you know, and then when Dom shows up in your door, I think when I introduced Dom to John D. Holman, he held his hand for 45 minutes before he even began to think to let it go, and he held on to it for another hour and a half. He wasn't letting go of Dom. He had never met someone like that. He was like, he grabbed his hand, that meant the world. So as Dom is a board member, when I say Dom, call up, can you come visit the guys or visit other people? Dom comes, and just being in the presence of someone like Dom, and especially these old guys, they, you know, Boo Hanks, John D. Holman, all these elders were so proud of Dom and what he had done and the things they had those aspirations when they were kids to see Dom take it to the end goal and win a Grammy and tour the world and sell tens of thousands of records and perform thousands of shows.
Yeah.
I mean, that was to our folks, that was Dom represents something they've dreamt of but thought would never happen, and they got to see it in their lifetime.
Yeah,
Very powerful figure there.
I can see the power of that, and I think something to sort of wrap some of this up for my audience here, that some of what you guys are talking about is, you know, when we talk about equity, we often think about who, once they're out there, who gets the attention, this person or that person. But even beginning, the idea of being able to conceive of being a professional musician is a privileged position in our society. It's a very expensive undertaking to try to be a musician.
Yeah.
You need a car.
You need a car. You need health insurance. Things that we don't have in this country if you don't have generational wealth.
Yeah.
So the fact that you guys have been bringing attention to this for 25 years, since 1994.
Close to 30. And that's the great word. Dom talked to me and we talked about cultural equity.
Yeah.
The real deal. And Alan told a great story when he went to Haiti for the first time. No one was playing that old folk music. And he recorded that folk music and set up these huge speakers and played it.
Yeah.
He came back 5 years later and the whole country's doing it. It's hard to understand the present in New Orleans. There wasn't a place that people could play traditional jazz. And Alan Jaffe started the Preservation Hall Jazz Band. Now jazz is all over the world because it had a way to go through it. And so even like Etta Baker or Boo Hanks and our Dom gets these CDs in these little public libraries in rural communities, and the youth are always watching, you know, and so that's, I think in a sense, Dom and I really strive for this cultural equity as a core of what Music Maker does. And I know that's a core of what Dom is all about.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And when I think about, well, Tim was mentioning that meeting with John D. Holman. See, Tim's album Bull Durham Blues was the very first album I found of Music Maker that was back in the Phoenix Public Library, as he mentioned. So when I first met Tim, I mentioned to him, oh, you know, you run Music Maker. And so I think Tim was surprised that I knew what Music Maker.
Yeah, I was.
And so even that is a part of the work that I've tried to do, is when meeting people, reaching out and letting them know that their work has helped me on my own journey. So when later on, when we first got to hanging out, Tim just said, "Hey, do you want to meet John D?" And I said, "Okay." And, I'm thinking at some point we'll meet John D, because of course, as someone seeing John D on a record, I assumed that John D might have been inaccessible. But Tim just picked up the phone and said, "Hey, John D, come on over." Click, and then all of a sudden John D comes up, and as he mentioned, he held my hand as he shook my hand, because he was so proud that there was a young African American person that was coming to learn his music. Because as I mentioned earlier in the interview, a lot of these tradition bearers, for one reason or another, their families they see the value of the music many times, but it's not guaranteed that they learn the music in the way that the elder learned the music, which was sitting at the feet of someone else. And so coming in as a younger performer who was interested in learning these styles, there was a power in that in of itself. And that's something that that music maker, again, Tim gave me a pile of CDs from their catalog, and I started learning songs off of it, like I learned anything else. And then I got to also be a performer that was a go-to person, auxiliary performer, to if they need a second guitar, or sometimes with the harmonica players, if they need a guitarist.
Produce records.
Yeah, I just would jump right in and I would do what I could to hold down the fort, and produced records as well for Music Maker.
Yeah.
I mean, and again, we could go on. we got so many projects we got to
There's
work on.
So much. Yeah. I want to thank Tim for joining us. I'm going to put up this banner again and ask folks that to donate to Dom so that he can donate to Music Maker and continue these traditions. And this group's doing great work. Thank you so much for joining us, Tim.
Thank you, and Godspeed for both of you, and bless you. Thank you so much for including us. I really appreciate the work that both of you guys are doing, and especially Dom. I'm honored that you took me on your show. And thank you, Alistair.
Thank you, sir.
All right, talk again soon. Yeah.
Yeah, man. So much. I feel like, God, I feel like we could talk for days. There's a lot of common stuff. I think some of the same stuff that excited you as a young guy is the same stuff that excited me, and you probably felt as weirdly anachronistic as I did, sort of.
Of course.
The kid who's into the weird old finger picking stuff.
Yeah.
But it presents differently. I want to go back a little bit. I listened to a bit of an interview with Justin Robinson, the third co-founder, with you and Rhiannon. And he touched on an experience that was powerful for him. And I want to get your thoughts on this, that once you guys created yourselves as a band and you started performing, you started having some success, and you started getting a seat at the table, being invited to the conferences and the festivals. Some of the opportunities that came up along the way, Justin felt smacked of something that felt troubling to him. And he talked in one interview about a gig you guys had that was on an old plantation, where you were playing as a string band and walking around and sort of making eye contact with the audience was there. This sort of feeling, it's something comedians sometimes talk about, that like getting the wrong laugh. It's not laughter, but there was a feeling, something clicked in him that said, this feels not right. Like we're being used to create some nostalgia for something that I don't want to be creating nostalgia for. How often did that sort of thing happen? What was your feeling about it? Or did you have that experience as well?
Well, I'll mention my impression of that. See, now Justin has a very different impression of how everything in the group developed. But coming from Gastonia, North Carolina, he was very sensitive to very specific parts of Southern culture. Now, this particular gig that we're talking about was part of the Spoleto Festival over in South Carolina, over toward Charleston. and we did a gig where we were performing out at an old plantation, and it was opened up for tourist visits and whatnot. I mean, the way that I always tried to think about all of these different events that we performed at, including something like that, I always tried to think of it as reclaiming, building a bridge, and just doing what we could as musical ambassadors to help create some type of healing in the course of bringing people together. Now, we were just about given the key to the city at this event, so nobody was saying anything negative as far as I noticed, and everyone was very appreciative that we were there. But again, with Justin, he was very sensitive to things like that. We were on an old plantation that had been a place where a lot of terrible things probably had happened. And he was really sensitive to those types of things. He always was very sensitive to any of that. So again, I did not read the situation as anything that was out of place necessarily. But I always treated all of the Carolina Chocolate Drops performances as we were brought in to bring hope and healing and good music to people. And I always treated every single gig in that manner. And because it is already a fine line to be able to play this old time music, but to feed into the negative aspects of the musical tradition that would negate anything that any progress that has been made socially, that's something that I never had advertised at all. So I always tried to treat it as something that was very positive. But again, as someone that's not originally from the South and the deep South, as we were at that particular moment in South Carolina, he had a very different impression of how things were being discussed and how things were being presented. But as someone who came in as a person who wanted to set the record straight as best as I could with music, that was it was just another show where we got to do just that. I mean, that was one of the reasons we became so popular as a group, was that these were hard conversations. This was the material opened conversations up that, again, with very lighthearted material, we were able to open up some very heavy, deep conversations of American history. So to act like that this heaviness wasn't a part of it would be naive. But at the same time, to perform the music is always a place where you can find a bridge. And for me, I always tried to make sure that that bridge went toward a progressive place where the audience could then imagine that a banjo player could be anybody, instead of it just being one idea or one archetype.
Right.
And that was something that was very important for me the whole time that the group was going on. And of course, ultimately, this is one of the reasons that Justin decided to leave over time, is he had trouble connecting with the audience in a way that he had learned to play old time music, which came from playing with friends in small circles. And once we expanded out into an international touring unit, that became much less comfortable for him as an individual, which ultimately led him to have to leave the road. So again, it's a very tough thing for me. I read a lot about different musicians, the heartaches, the good times that they had by reading their biographies and reading their stories. So when I came into the space of being an international performer and performing more than 200 dates a year, I just assumed that was part of the territory. And so I was always trying to push in a progressive direction so that the music itself could expand. And so that was something that's just a part of my personality. I'm a workhorse in that type of way. So that's and I've read a couple of other things with Justin as well, that again, he was not articulate about these things when we were performing per se, but over time he was very uncomfortable because it took it out of the original context in which he learned the music, and which is completely understandable.
It's really interesting. Thanks for that, Dom, because I think it speaks to having different experiences, how you perceive these things, but it speaks to other stuff too. I think it seems to me that one thing that your group and that you and Rihanna in particular, as you do interviews and conduct your career, is that you've done a good job of controlling the narrative. But to come with that, there has to be an intentionality, realizing that there is a responsibility, or there's a different weight on your shoulders as Black musicians doing this kind of music, and how it's going to be perceived and how that story is going to be told. And even when you were talking earlier about yourself as a storyteller, that this is you're telling your own story too. It's
right.
Sort of not leaving it to other people to put this in the context that fits their idea of where this belongs. And I know, Rihanna, who's gotten a lot of attention in recent years, she's really brought that kind of intention to every interview. And I've only seen a few, but there's a real focus on, let's go back and talk about where this music comes from. Let's go back and talk about where the perception of who started playing the banjo comes from. It's sort of teachable. As somebody who spends a lot of time with kids, it feels a lot like teachable moments. Like, let me take your question as an opportunity to educate here.
Well, absolutely. Well, that's one of the things that is so special about knowing a lot of different types of old time music, is that you can spread the knowledge. I do. One of the things I've tried to do when I'm presenting stories out to the public is to show that people know more about the music than they are willing to give themselves credit for. For folk music, again, it seems arcane. It seems far away. It seems, like this old esoteric music that isn't connected to the present. But part of what I do as a performer is to show that we're a lot more familiar with folk music than we give ourselves credit for. And that there are many examples of music that we might all know that are considered folk music in one form or another, and that it may not be described in one way or another as folk music, but it's still a part of the living continuum of music that we have in this country. And so that's how I've always tried to present my story. So I always have tried my best to showcase the triumphs and to showcase the places where you have musicians that are creating, and that they are creating brand new styles and genres that are invigorating the world. That's one of the reasons why, in some ways, it always seems like I'm looking backward when I'm talking. But to understand that to reach back and to take it into the present and move it forward, that is a full circle of life, death, and rebirth. And it's connected with a proverb that I learned many years ago from a mentor of mine, Sule Greg Wilson. And the proverb is Sankofa. And it's a very powerful Ashanti statement that means just that: going back, fetching it, bringing the things from the past into the present. And that in of itself can lead to the future. And see that, because when I think about a lot of old time music and arranging it, I think of it the same way that you would, most people might think of a jazz arrangement, where you have a style, you have a form, you have a way that you are improvising. I can't help but think of another performer I got to see very early on in Arizona by the name of Dave Van Ronk, who is a very famous folk music performer. And he was very influential on me in the way that he was able to arrange complex piano parts into guitar language, and to be able to pick these songs and to pick some very interesting material and recast it in a way that was unique to his own personal style, while still being very much rooted in tradition. And I've always tried to figure out ways to do that. Of course, another person that I think about is Big Bill Broonzy. He's always an inspiration because of his way of being able to do the same thing, having started in a folk tradition, and then his style evolves into this very urban tradition that actually is part of the foundations of rock and roll. Mm-hmm. And then he recasts himself yet again in the 1940s and 50s as an acoustic troubadour, taking all of the things he had learned from his earlier career and applying it in a way that would have him akin to people like Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, who he also mentored, and Leadbelly, Brownie McGee, and Sonny Terry. So in certain ways, I always try to tell a little bit of those stories while I'm trying to create modern music, because I don't know, as a record collector myself, as you can see on the back wall, there's a power to being able to love a song and then to be able to read something about that song and learn something more about the performer, learn something more about the history of the song, or even learn something, as you get deeper into it, learn something about song form and song structure, which is different than Euroclassical song structure. And of course, in the 21st century, it's kind of given that you don't have to write music to make music, but to be able to look at folk music as a form and as a vocabulary, that's something that you can use to create a brand new type of music. And that's what we do with the Chocolate Drops. We did traditional songs, but our arrangements, and particularly when I added different aspects of folk music tradition to the fiddle and banjo music, all of a sudden we were creating a brand new experience for people that was even different than it was in the past. It was something that was thoroughly modern, while still musically having the vocabulary of the past. So it reflected for people who knew the music, or if people were a record collector, or anybody that might get into the old time stuff. We gave them a conduit to be able to get into the old time stuff, but we were never fully just stagnantly trying to reproduce the music without trying to put a little bit of ourselves in it. And again, this is a thing that Justin Robinson and I talked about a lot. In his mind, when we were performing, he didn't think that we created a lot of music because we weren't writing the songs, but I felt we created a lot of music with the unique arrangements that we performed within that group. So there was always a little bit of tension of when it even came to the way that we decided to articulate what was our message, what was our art, everything like that. And early on in the group, I was the one that would collect all of the material, do the A&R work, put the albums together, give that to the record label, and then we would come and cut all the material, and then I would sequence the records as well. So when it came to the documentation and the packaging, that was me doing that. Justin and Rhiannon really didn't like to be bothered with things like that. And I had the artistic and the librarian's notion of how to, document and annotate all of our music, that I was always the go-to for that. So when it came to packaging, that was something that I also tried to do, was make sure that we had exciting packaging that would reflect the modern era,
I mean, and that's a form of creation. Is you're curating, like a museum curator. You're choosing what things to put beside each other so that they tell a story, the way those songs are, sandwiched together. That creates something new in and of itself. Something that I want to be. We're already over the time. I promised your minute may not be. It's just so fun talking to you. So I do want to let you go, but there was something that really struck me in what you just said. No, maybe it's not important enough if I can't bring it to the front of my mind. In thinking about going back to my earlier question, this question that I had as a young man, which was, as somebody who was drawn to this roots music, Dave Van Ronk was a big hero for me, Dylan, John Prine, but I kept going backwards, Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and then discovered Elizabeth Cotton and Leadbelly. All these folks, Mississippi John Hurt, I would sit around and wonder as a young man, where are the artists of color in this field? And it's taken me decades and increasingly trying to be part of the solution to that question, that there's a lot that white gatekeepers can be doing that haven't always been doing, to make sure that those doors are not just open, but that people are called to, we want you here, we want to learn, we want to commune. But But one of the things that somewhere along the way struck me too, and I want to get your thoughts on this, is that one of the reasons African Americans perhaps moved away from the idea of string band music and these older forms that you guys have reclaimed so powerfully is that it comes with a huge amount of pain. It's wrapped up with so much of American history that's painful, that for many young artists, looking forward to newer forms like hip hop seemed like a way of creating art that didn't maybe require looking back at that painful history. But it seems that there's change afoot. Some of the folks I work with regularly, Reggie Harris is somebody that I have a regular program with. Reggie's been doing this his whole life, right?
Yeah.
His whole life of 70 years. But I see more and more young performers of color coming in, and it strikes me that you guys have a lot to do with that. That you haven't just gone through a door yourself, but that you and other groups like you have made younger performers of color say, maybe this is a place that I can find an audience, maybe this is a place that I can find community, and maybe it's a place that I can control some of the narrative. If I'm going to delve into these painful historical musical forms, the stuff that about them that's painful, I can do it in a way that I can tell the story and reclaim that story. That's a huge, big matzo ball of a question to throw at you, but do you have thoughts on that? Did you experience any of that yourself? Did you ever feel that this music carried too much pain, or right from the beginning, did you feel like, I want to go to all the complexity and richness of that music?
Well, for me, I wanted to face all of that complexity head on. I was so drawn to, again, being a literature fan and a history fan. I found that the music was so illuminating when it came to describing history that wasn't necessarily in books, and also describing people's thoughts about history outside of the books as well, because there are songs that have commentary about well-known events through history, and they have different perspectives based on what the history might say compared to what the people are saying. And that was something that was always of interest to me. And of course, as I got further into the old-timey music, I found that there was a lot of pain. There was a lot of racial injustice that was a part of the history. But that was always part of the fuel for showcasing the stories for me. It was always, in some ways, it was allowing me to be able to take those, some of those musicians who did not get their rightful due. People like Papa Charlie Jackson or Gus Cannon are two examples of fine musicians who made a lot of recordings, but they both died penniless and died with no one knowing about them until you had record collectors begin to start compiling their music together in one form or another. And Gus Cannon got to perform again in the 50s and the 60s as an older man. But there are so many different performers that never got that due. So as a modern performer, to be able to perform in those old styles and in some ways do a bit of character acting to be able to present those styles in a fashion that is recognizable as an older style or as a folk form, I think that's something that I've always thought is that's always been a very important piece of the puzzle for me. And with the Carolina Chocolate Drops, it was very important as well to be able to be a group that could perform the old-timey music. And again, we took our cues. You know, it's funny, Tim mentioned the Beatles. I incorporated the Beatles used to do a bow that was all in unison at the end of their shows. And I incorporated that into the Carolina Chocolate Drops whenever we finished a show. And you can find a lot of pictures of us doing this. We had a bow that was uniform right at the end of the show that we would do. That was very formal. And that was, you know, so we were always trying to take smaller ideas, theatrical ideas from performers who had done really well, like the Beatles. That bow alone was one thing that we used. And I use that a lot in my solo shows, especially when I've had a band. We do a unison bow. Also, we were drawn in by people like the New Lost City Ramblers, because we were three individual artists who had individual repertoires and perspectives on the music we were playing. And then we had come together as a collective unit. And that was how the original group was put together. So in some ways, we were very similar to the New Lost City Ramblers, where people love old time music on record, but they would rather see it played live. And they'd rather see it played by current groups, whoever the current group might be. And that was something that we were able to present as sort of a new version of the New Lost City Ramblers. Of course, then I was connected to Mike, and I got to know all four of the New Lost City Ramblers over the years. And so I took a lot of ideas from them and their advice of how to present music in a collective aspect. And so just doing that alone allowed for not only a new generation of people to be able to start performing the music, because we were a group that was performing these old time styles, but it also allowed for people that were not white to look and see that there had been a group that had existed. Because you have to imagine, again, this is a little bit heady to think about, but at that time, African American performers were only solo performers for the most part. And there might be a mixed race band, or there might be a solo blues singer or fiddler or something like that. But to have an all African American group that was performing this old time music that was rooted in African American tradition, that was such a powerful combination. And I had been busking on the street for 5 years by the time the groups had been brought together. And we got a standing ovation at every single show of the Carolina Chocolate Drops. And I knew that was a rarity. It was something that was much bigger than just the music, even though they loved the music and we tried to make that exciting. But there was something extra that was being presented to the audience that now the group as a as an entity of the past, of the performances we did in the past, it still is an inspiration to people because of that. But of course, I can't expect anybody to follow our exact path. There are just a few performers that are doing deeply rooted traditional music as the forefront of their repertoire. But it's still the same thing that I saw when we first started the group. Mostly singer-songwriters, or maybe blues performers are the main African-American roots performers. But people that are using traditional music as the forefront of their repertoire and presenting that in an academic sort of way, that's still something that we haven't seen a lot of. But the group as a symbol has we got to go to so many places, and we got to do so many different amazing performances and play at many different venues, that we were able to open the doors in the way that, the presenters then saw that there was a value to having a broader palette to what they're presenting on stage, which again, it isn't something that we necessarily tried to, we never tried to hit it home so hard that we were trying to be offensive to anybody. But we always made a point to mention that the doors need to be open. The people who are speaking about the academic explanation of African American folk music traditions, we knew that needed to be expanded in some type of way. Of course, there are new questions that a lot of the younger people are having to deal with now about representation that are much different than what we dealt with in the Chocolate Drops. But at our particular juncture, it was a moment when people were ready to see that history, and it wasn't going to be just met with opposition. And we were very fortunate that we were able to come in at such a time. And of course, we had the support of Music Maker, and as you've seen, Tim he's okay with breaking down some doors as well. So we were able to get our music presented as we wanted to present it, in a way that is very special, and it was still rooted in the tradition that we were wanting to present. And that was something that was very important about those first releases on Music Maker, is that Tim didn't try to mold our sound. And that was something that was so important, because many times when you begin to perform out as a band or as a musical entity, you are instantly met with feedback of what you should and shouldn't be doing. And the fact that we had 5 to 6 years where we were able to run things ourselves and run our own business as well, that was something that was very important, and we couldn't have done that without music makers' early participation with the group. And so,
Yeah.
we were very fortunate. It was like lightning in a bottle to be able to bring that particular group together. But again, now with all of the documentation, one of the things I tried to do is I tried to document every time I was given a CD at a radio station at a board recording from a live performance. I put that all in the Southern Folklife collection, and there's about, I don't know, 10 or 12 linear feet worth of Chocolate Drops material laying around in there.
Well, appreciate your work, both with the Chocolate Drops and on your own. And it's wonderful to see what you're continuing to do, Dom. I'll be following your story. I know this audience will. If you grant me a last couple of minutes here to do a little housekeeping, I'll come back and say goodbye. All right, we have coming up next month on February 6th is the last in this series for this season. I'll be joined by my friends from the family music world, Saul Paul and Uno Dos Tres Andres. Uno Dos Tres Andres was just nominated for Best Children's Album, and Saul Paul is part of a Black Collective album called One Tribe Collective that was also nominated. Both of these acts are part of a collective with me and 9 other folks called Family Music Forward that has been trying to change the conversation in that particular field. So we'll be talking some with them and with maybe other members of the Family Music Forward Racial Justice Coalition about our work in that field. Opening Doors Race Conversation and Song is brought to you by the anti-racism team of the Melrose Unitarian Universalist Church and produced by Stacy Babb. Tom, thank you for joining us. We didn't get to as much music as I hoped, but there was so much conversation to dig into, and you've been very generous with your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Alistair, and we'll have to get together again sometime and chat some more.
I can't wait. I feel like we could do a whole other session right now.
Oh yeah, well, I didn't get a chance to bring out some special treats.
Oh yeah, you mentioned
some of these. I had some of these LPs just.
Can you hold them up?
This is another part of what I've done over the years. I've curated a little bit. So this is a beautiful copy of Odetta Sings Ballads and Blues that I picked up years ago, 2007, when I got a chance to open up for her. And I got a couple of other ones that let's see, let me just grab a highlight here.
Yeah, I want to see these.
This is one that I got at a festival dedicated to Mississippi John Hurt.
I know that album.
And this is I have Taj Mahal on here, Jim Queskin, Jesse Colin Young, Piedmont Blues Duo, and Guy Davis, all on this record here. And also Mary Wright, Mississippi John Hurt's granddaughter's on here. So I did a festival, and again, that's one of the things that just for my own personal, on top of really enjoying the music, if I know that I'm going to get a chance to meet up with folks, again, it's all about trying to advocate for the music. A lot of the times folks in the folk community, they don't even know that people care about their music. And just to be able to come up with one of their records, like Taj, I've done that 2 or 3 times. I've pulled out a copy of Sounder, pulled out this Recycling the Blues and other related stuff. And just to see the way that any of these performers light up when they see these old records, and to be able to know that their music is translating forward to somebody else. That's something that you can do for someone, almost like the old song says, give me the roses while I live. And that's one of the things I try to live my musical life around is giving the roses while folks are here. And that's a beautiful thing I've had a chance to do many different times.
It is beautiful. It's great that you've been able to make those connections and reconnect with some of those people, as you know, as fellow people who love roots music and tradition. We lose our legends by the month. So every opportunity you get to make those connections, and something I've been learning for myself is to give those roses while people are here with us too. We lose them along the way, and sometimes you don't get a chance to tell them how meaningful they were to you. So I'm glad you figured that out earlier than I did.
Well, I learned the thing I learned later on was carrying a camera. That was the one thing I found is, now that everybody has phones and they do selfies all the time, I wish I had kept a camera with me and 12 years ago for a couple of different moments where I could have used a good picture just to have that memory in my mind,
Yep. Yep. All right, Dom, I got to let you go. You've been too generous, and it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on the program. Thank you again, Alex.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Tune in next month.
Take care, everybody. Please keep supporting Music Maker and keep supporting live music, whatever you do.